It was the kind of night where the wine flowed too easily, the laughter too loud, and the egos far too inflated. At the rooftop lounge of the Corinthia Hotel in New York City, with views of Manhattan glittering below, Blake Harrison sat reclined in a leather armchair, surrounded by a coterie of equally young, wealthy, and smug companions. Blake, 32, was the kind of man who had never been told no. Tech entrepreneur turned investor, his name was often seen in glossy magazines, always with a different model, always smiling that shark smile. Tall, sharply dressed, dark-haired, and dangerously charming, he had the confidence of someone who thought life was a game, and everyone else just pawns. "All right, boys," Blake said with a half-smirk, holding his whiskey glass midair. "Give me a real challenge. Something stupid. Something reckless." Theo, his oldest friend and worst influence, leaned in. "Okay. You say you can have any woman you want. That you could even marry one if you had to. What if you actually did?" Blake raised an eyebrow. "Marry one? Yeah," Theo grinned. "But not a model. Not a trophy. Not someone Instagram perfect. Someone unexpected." The others began to catch on. Lucas, the banker, laughed. "Oh, I got it. Someone completely off-brand for you. How about someone overweight? Average life, average job, no glam. Let's see how long you can last without checking out." Laughter erupted, but Theo leaned in closer, his tone turning serious. 3 months. You marry her, stay married for 90 days. No running, no disappearing, no cheating. Just live the life of a normal guy. Be a husband. Blake sipped his whiskey slowly. "And if I do it?" "I'll give you the lake house in Vermont," Theo said. Blake narrowed his eyes. The lake house was worth a few million, and it held sentimental value to Theo. "You're serious?" "As a heart attack. But if you bail, you give up your spot in the Kingsbridge Fund." Silence fell over the group. That fund was Blake's baby, his pride, his power play. The room felt heavier now. Blake's ego and ambition wrestled for a moment. Then he smiled. "All right," he said slowly, like a predator eyeing prey. "You want me to marry someone overweight and ordinary, and stay married for 3 months?" "Yep. Fine." He tossed back the rest of his drink. "Let's play." The next afternoon, Blake walked into the downtown public library. Not a place he'd ever been unless cameras were involved. He wore a wool coat over a designer suit, his presence both out of place and magnetic. He scanned the desks and bookshelves until he saw her. Emma Collins. She sat at the reference desk, surrounded by worn volumes and a computer screen too small for her work. She was in her early 30s, with soft features, curly brown hair pulled into a loose bun, and kind eyes behind simple glasses. Her body, round and full, contrasted starkly with the women Blake was used to. But her smile, God, that smile, was genuine. He watched as she helped a teenager find a book for a school project. Patient, warm, a quiet light about her. "This is the one," Blake said to himself, straightening his collar. "Hi," he said later, standing before her desk. Emma looked up, a bit startled. "Hi. Can I help you find something?" "Yeah. I think I just did." His smile was disarming. Emma blinked, unsure whether to laugh or blush. "Sorry. I was looking for something real. Something rare. And I think I found it." She laughed softly, her cheeks turning pink. "That's a new one. Most people come in for tax forms or Wi-Fi." He leaned in, lowering his voice. "What if I said I came for the librarian?" She gave him a half-smile, amused but cautious. "Are you serious?" He looked her in the eye, and for the first time in his life, faked sincerity. "Dead serious." She laughed again, awkward, disbelieving, but charmed in spite of herself. It had been years since someone noticed her, really noticed her. Years since someone looked at her like that. And she had no idea she was the center of a cruel game. The wedding happened fast. Too fast for Emma's world to catch up. In just a few weeks, Blake had taken her on dates she never dreamed possible. Boat rides on the Hudson, dinners in candlelit rooftops, impromptu trips to the Met just to admire how the light hit her face near the Monet section. He said all the right things, touched her hand with tenderness, and looked into her eyes like she was the only woman in the world. Emma, who had always lived a quiet life between bookshelves and teacups, fell hard. She was 34 and had never truly been in love. Never kissed under the rain. Never been called breathtaking without a hint of irony. When Blake got down on one knee in front of the library steps, holding a simple vintage ring and asking her to be his forever, she whispered yes with tears in her eyes. Her friends were skeptical. "Emma, are you sure? It's all happening so fast." "I know," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "But maybe it's finally my time. Maybe love doesn't need to take years." The wedding was small, as Emma requested. Blake didn't argue. In fact, he barely planned. He let her choose everything, from the flowers to the food. He only cared about the deadline. They married in a garden in Central Park, under a weak winter sun. Emma wore a tea-length dress that hugged her curves with elegance, her hair loose, her smile radiant. Blake looked perfect in his tailored tux, but distant. She didn't notice. Not then. She was too overwhelmed by happiness. By disbelief. "This is real," she kept thinking. "This is mine." After the ceremony, there was a soft toast, a few photos, and a quick dance to Ella Fitzgerald. Emma clung to him during the slow song, resting her head on his chest. He barely held her back. Then the moment came. Inside the sleek penthouse that was now her home, Emma stepped out of the bedroom later that night, barefoot, wearing a pale silk robe. She was nervous, shy, but hopeful. Ready to start her married life. Blake stood by the window, phone in hand, scrolling. She smiled. "Hey." He didn't look up. "Hey. I thought, maybe we could sit, talk a bit. Just, I don't know. Be together." He turned slightly, glanced at her robe, then back at his phone. "I'm tired. Long day. I think I'll crash early." "Oh, okay. Sure." He walked past her without a second glance. She stood alone in the hallway, heart thudding. The silence settled like dust. Days passed. Blake was polite, distant, present in body, absent in spirit. Emma tried. She made breakfast, suggested walks, tried to share little things about her day. In return, she got nods, vague smiles, and a consistent "I'm busy." He didn't yell. He didn't cheat. He simply wasn't there. Like a ghost. The man who had once said she was radiant now barely looked at her face. And so the fairy tale faded, slowly, quietly. Emma started waking up to cold sheets beside her, a colder silence over dinner, and a growing ache that no book could distract her from. She didn't know about the bet. She only knew that the man who said, "I do," now acted like he hadn't. And she was still trying to figure out why. The days turned into weeks. The silence became a routine. Emma's marriage was no longer strange. It was just empty. Every morning, Blake was already gone before she woke. He left behind the scent of cologne and a barely touched coffee. At night, he returned late, always with some excuse. Meetings, events, business dinners. He'd drop his keys on the table, check his phone, mumble a good night, and disappear into his office or bedroom, whichever Emma wasn't in. She tried. God, she tried. She cooked. Her lemon rosemary chicken, her grandmother's cinnamon bread, fresh soups when the weather turned cold. Blake ate without comment. Sometimes he didn't even look at the plate. She left notes on the fridge, "Dinner at 7 if you're free. I'd love to watch something together tonight. Hope your meeting went well." No response. Not even the notes were moved. She brought up ideas for weekends. "There's a jazz concert at the park. We could go together." "I'm slammed." "What about a short trip? Just us. We could drive to Vermont, get some fresh air." "I've got things lined up." Not a good time. He never raised his voice. Never argued. But the distance screamed louder than any fight could. Emma began to shrink inside herself. Bit by bit. Smile by smile. She stopped asking about his day. Stopped cooking as much. The book she was reading stayed closed on the nightstand. The meals grew quieter. Shorter. She watched Blake with cautious eyes, hoping to find a spark, something, anything, that would show he still saw her. That she still mattered. But he didn't see her. Not really. Until one Tuesday evening. Emma had spent the whole day preparing his favorite dish, not that he'd ever told her, but she'd overheard him mention it on a call weeks ago, osso buco with saffron risotto. She set the table, lit 2 candles, played soft music in the background. Blake walked in, loosened his tie, gave her a faint nod, and walked right past. "Dinner's ready," she said gently. He paused, looked at the table, then at her. "I already ate." Something inside her broke in that moment. A small, quiet snap, like the sound of a thin string pulled too tight for too long. Emma stared at him. "Do you even remember why you married me?" He blinked, caught off guard. She didn't wait for the answer. That night, she didn't cry. Not like before. She simply folded the napkins, turned off the candles, and washed the dishes in silence. Then she made a choice. The next morning, Blake found her room empty. Her things still there, but she was gone. At first, he didn't think much of it. Probably at the library. But when she wasn't back by lunch or dinner, he texted her. "Everything okay?" She didn't answer. When she did return, she went straight to the guest room. Didn't explain. Didn't fight. Just stopped trying. Emma began leaving early and returning late. She joined a reading club again. Picked up volunteering at a community center. She visited her old friends. She smiled more, outside that apartment. Blake noticed the lights were off more often in her side of the penthouse. The air felt different. Lighter in one corner, colder in another. He noticed something else, too. Her coffee cup wasn't next to his in the mornings anymore. The scent of her lavender lotion no longer lingered in the shared bathroom. And for the first time, he was the one waiting at the table, with food turning cold in front of him. Emma wasn't angry. She wasn't confrontational. She was just gone. And Blake realized, with an unfamiliar tightness in his chest, he missed something. Someone. But he couldn't name what. Not yet. It didn't happen all at once. Emma didn't storm out, didn't shout, didn't break things. She didn't leave dramatic letters or ultimatums. She just slipped away from the life she was no longer a part of. One day, she moved her books to the guest room. Another, she stopped leaving dinner on the table. Then, she stopped being home at all in the evenings. Blake only noticed in fragments. First, the empty chair at breakfast. Then, the missing sound of her soft humming while cleaning or reading. The fridge began to feel emptier. The warmth of fresh-baked bread no longer filled the air. Her laughter, something he once dismissed as cute but constant, was gone. And he missed it. He didn't understand why. On a cold Friday night, Blake came home early for once. The penthouse echoed in a way that felt too loud. "Emma?" he called. Silence. He walked through the living room. Her favorite blanket, usually draped on the couch, was missing. The mug with the little blue stars she always used was gone from the drying rack. He stood still for a moment, oddly uneasy. He opened the door to her old room. Empty bed. Lamp off. Books gone. He checked the guest room. There it was. Her lamp. Her books. Her scarf. And on the nightstand, a journal. Closed. Private. He didn't touch it. For the first time, he respected a boundary he hadn't even realized she had drawn. Over the next few weeks, Emma's life bloomed, quietly and without him. She started attending a creative writing group at a small cafe near Union Square. She spent Saturday mornings organizing shelves at the local community center. She reconnected with Hannah and Carla, her college friends, who welcomed her back without questions. They just hugged her and said, "It's about time." She was no longer asking Blake to join her for dinner or walk in the park. She was taking those walks alone. With podcasts. With the sound of her own thoughts. And, eventually, with peace. Blake noticed. He noticed that her eyes no longer flicked to him when he entered a room. That she didn't bother with small talk. That when they crossed paths in the hallway, she smiled the way you smile at a stranger. Polite. Distant. She wasn't angry. She just wasn't his anymore. And it started to hurt in ways Blake didn't know he could feel. He began to hear the echoes of everything he'd missed. The soft laughter that no longer danced around the kitchen. The smell of books and vanilla from her reading nook. The way she used to say, "Good morning," like she meant it. And the worst part? He couldn't remember when all of it disappeared. Because he never noticed it arriving in the first place. One night, Blake was in the kitchen, staring at the microwave clock blinking 2:13 a.m. He opened the cabinet, searching for something. He didn't know what. He reached for a mug. His hand froze. It was her mug. The one with the stars. She must have used it earlier. Put it back. Quietly. Like she always did. He held it in his hands and, for the first time in months, sat at the kitchen table in complete stillness. That's when it hit him, not like a punch, but like a slow flood breaking through a cracked wall. He missed her. Not the woman he married as part of a joke. Not the woman he kept at arm's length. But her. Emma. The woman who read until sunrise. Who made too much soup and shared it with neighbors. Who laughed at her own jokes and cried during dog movies. The woman who used to sit across from him, hoping to be seen. Now, she wasn't even looking anymore. And Blake had never felt more alone in his life. Blake Harrison had everything. Yet, for the first time in his life, he walked through his home and felt like a stranger in a museum of someone else's memories. It started with small, unexplainable moments, like catching himself staring at the hallway where Emma used to leave her umbrella, or standing too long at the doorway of the guest room, listening for sounds that never came. He told himself it was just guilt, or maybe boredom, but he knew deep down that something far more unsettling was happening. He was beginning to miss her. Not in a superficial, fleeting way, but in a real, bone-deep ache he couldn't easily label. One evening, while waiting for his car outside his office, he pulled out his phone to scroll through photos, something he rarely did. Most were filled with shallow smiles from events, parties, and meaningless weekends. But then, tucked between them, a forgotten photo appeared. Emma. She was sitting on a park bench, holding a paper cup of hot chocolate, laughing at something he had said. The photo wasn't posed. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, and her eyes were crinkled at the corners. He didn't even remember taking it. He stared at the screen for a long time. That smile wasn't just beautiful, it was true. And he realized with a quiet horror that he hadn't seen it in weeks. He began to recall other things. The way she'd tuck her hair behind her ear when she was thinking. How she always left the window open just a crack at night, even in the winter. How she whispered "thank you" to waiters, cashiers, even cab drivers, as if their presence in her life mattered deeply. He remembered how, once, during a blizzard, she brought soup to the doorman downstairs because she said he looked tired. Blake had laughed at the gesture then. Now, the memory made his chest tighten. She was good. So good that he hadn't even understood the weight of her presence until it was gone. One night, unable to sleep, Blake walked past the guest room and noticed the light on beneath the door. He hesitated, then knocked softly. There was a pause. Then Emma's voice, quiet but steady. "Yes. It's me." A longer silence. "I figured." He leaned against the doorframe, not sure what to say. He wanted to apologize, to explain, but every sentence he rehearsed in his mind sounded empty. He just stood there, foolish and suddenly aware of how much space separated them now. "I was just wondering if you needed anything," he finally said. "No," she replied gently. "But thank you." He nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "All right. Good night, Emma." "Good night, Blake." The door remained closed, and for the first time he realized the weight of that barrier between them. It was no longer made of wood or silence. It was made of time, of choices, of everything he had failed to be. In the days that followed, he began to truly see her. Not in the way a man glances at his wife across the room, but the way a person watches something they don't believe they deserve. From a distance. Quietly. Carefully. She smiled more now, but never at him. She was lighter on her feet, her steps confident, her words kinder than necessary, but always wrapped in a tone that said, "You don't live here anymore." "Not inside me." One afternoon, he passed by the living room and found her laughing over a video call with a friend. Her laughter filled the space like music. Blake stood in the hallway and closed his eyes, just listening. Not daring to interrupt. He had no right to. That night, he sat alone in the kitchen, the silence pressing on him like a weight. He picked up a pen and paper, not something he'd done in years, and began writing. He didn't try to charm her. He didn't make excuses. He simply wrote, "I've started seeing you. I don't mean with my eyes, I mean really seeing you. And I wish I had done it sooner. I don't expect anything. I just needed you to know." He left the note on the dining table. The next morning, it was gone. Nothing was said. But that was the first time in weeks Emma left a second mug of coffee on the counter, next to his. The days that followed were quieter, but not in the same way they had been before. This silence was heavier. It was filled with things unsaid, emotions unexpressed, and the slow collapse of a man who was finally waking up. Blake had begun to feel the truth of what he had lost, and more painfully, what he might never get back. Emma had become a presence he sought out, not to control, not to impress, but to understand. And each time he saw her pass him in the hallway, her steps light, her eyes somewhere far from him, he realized that her world no longer included him. He wanted to talk to her, to explain, to beg, to undo. But every time he opened his mouth, the words felt small next to the damage he had caused. One night, he caught her in the kitchen after dinner. She had just finished making a pie, the scent of cinnamon and apples drifting through the air. He leaned against the doorframe, uncertain. "Emma," he said softly, "can we talk?" She didn't flinch, didn't avoid him. She simply turned, towel still in hand, and nodded. "I'm listening." He took a slow breath. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you. I know that. But I need to tell you something. Not to win you back. Just to be honest, for once." Emma folded the towel, placed it neatly on the counter, and faced him fully. "I'm listening, Blake." His voice faltered as he tried to hold her gaze. "When I married you, I did it for reasons I'm ashamed of. I was arrogant, selfish, and blind. But in these last weeks, something's changed. Not because I lost you, because I finally saw you. For the first time, really saw you." He paused, searching her eyes for a sign. She gave him nothing. You are the kindest person I've ever met. You carry more strength than anyone I know. And I broke that. I broke you. And I'm sorry. Not because I'm losing you, but because I never deserved you to begin with. Emma's expression was unreadable. She took a small step forward, not closer to him, but closer to ending something. You say you see me now, she said gently. But I was right in front of you the whole time. I waited. I tried. I gave you every piece of me. You didn't wake up when I needed you most. And now, I'm not yours to save, Blake. She reached into her bag and pulled out a white envelope. She held it out to him, steady. You don't have to sign it now. I just wanted you to know it's real. Blake looked at it, dread filling his chest. Emma, please, she shook her head, her voice calm but firm. No drama. No begging. You're not the villain of some love story. You're just a man who didn't show up in time. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving him alone with the papers in his hand and the quiet devastation of finally feeling something, when it was far too late. The divorce papers sat on the table for 3 days before Blake touched them again. He didn't sign. He didn't shred them either. He just looked at the envelope each night like it might change if he stared hard enough. As if the ink would vanish, the reality would reverse, and the woman who once waited for him at dinner would somehow still be waiting. But she wasn't. Emma was gone. Not physically. She still came and went from the penthouse with the same quiet grace, but emotionally, she had left him long before she handed him that envelope. He could see it in her eyes, calm, resolute, untouched by his newfound desperation. On the 4th morning, Blake knocked on her door. Emma answered, already dressed, her hair pulled back, purse in hand. She didn't look surprised. I'm not here to beg, he started, his voice raw. I just want to talk. She paused, then stepped aside. 5 minutes. He walked in, clutching the divorce papers but not bringing them up. I've changed, Emma. I swear to you. I started therapy last week. I'm stepping away from the fund for a while. I've signed up to volunteer at the community center. You know, the one you told me about. I'm not doing it to impress you. I'm doing it because I can't go back to the man I was. And I don't want to. Emma listened without emotion, her eyes steady on his face. I believe you, she said simply. Blake blinked. You do? Yes. She stepped closer, her voice soft but sharp. But that doesn't change what happened. You didn't love me when I needed love. You didn't choose me when I was right there, trying, hurting, hoping. I didn't understand. No, she interrupted gently. You didn't care. Not enough. And now that I've started caring about myself, I won't go back just because you're ready now. He looked down, his voice cracking. So that's it? There's nothing I can say to change your mind. There's nothing you should say, she replied. You had 3 months to be my husband. And you weren't. Emma picked up her bag and opened the door. But Blake, if you really have changed, don't prove it to me. He looked at her, confused. Then who? Prove it to yourself. Become someone you can respect. She stepped out without slamming the door or looking back. And for the first time in his life, Blake Harrison felt what it was to be left behind. Not by circumstance, not by business, not by chance, but by someone who once believed in him more than he ever did himself. That night, he wrote his first letter. He didn't send it, but he wrote it. Dear Emma, today I spent the morning at the center you told me about. A boy there asked if I could help him build a robot out of cereal boxes. I said no at first. I had no idea what I was doing. But then I saw his face. I stayed. We finished the robot. It was terrible. He loved it. I think I'm starting to understand what presence means. Yours, if not by title, then by lesson. Blake. He left the letter in a drawer. A small promise to himself. And the beginning of a different kind of fight. One without guarantees, without shortcuts, and without her waiting on the other side. Blake didn't show up at Emma's doorstep with roses or some grand apology speech. That would have been too easy, too performative, and far too late. Instead, he showed up at the community center at 8 a.m. on a rainy Saturday, wearing jeans for the first time in years and holding a crate of donated school supplies. He didn't know Emma would be there. In fact, he hoped she wouldn't. Because this time, it wasn't about her seeing him, it was about him becoming someone worth being seen. At first, the volunteers treated him with the polite suspicion reserved for people who smelled like money but looked lost with a hammer. He didn't take offense. He swept floors. He stacked boxes. He broke a shelf trying to fix it, apologized, then spent an hour repairing it properly. He came back the next day. Then the next. And slowly, the staff stopped whispering about him. They started asking him for help. He started writing letters to Emma every Sunday. Not to ask her back. Not to explain. Just to share what he was learning. He never mailed them. Just sealed each one, dated it, and placed it in a wooden box he kept in his closet. Dear Emma, today I helped clean a supply room. Found a note a kid wrote to his future self. Said he wants to learn to trust adults again. That wrecked me. I wonder how many people feel the same about love. Weeks passed. Blake found himself listening more, talking less. In therapy, he stopped asking how to fix things and started asking why he had broken them to begin with. He confronted his ego, his patterns, his fear of being truly known. He wasn't chasing Emma anymore. He was chasing the man he should have been all along. One Thursday afternoon, while unloading a truck of canned goods at the center, he heard a familiar voice behind him. Didn't think I'd see you here twice. Let alone twice a week. He turned. Emma. She wore jeans and a gray hoodie, her hair braided to the side, no makeup, holding a clipboard. She looked beautiful, not in the effortless, flawless way he'd once chased in others, but in a real, human, grounded way. He stood there for a second too long before finding words. I like it here, he said honestly. I think I needed to see life outside of myself. Emma nodded. No smile, but no coldness either. Good. It's honest work. He hesitated. How are you? Better, she said. Stronger. She was about to walk away when he added, I've been writing to you. She stopped, turned. Letters. I don't send them. I just write. For the first time in months, her eyes softened. You don't owe me that. I know, he said. But I think I owe myself the honesty, even if it doesn't change anything. Emma looked at him carefully, her expression unreadable. Good, she said. Keep writing. And she walked away. But she didn't walk fast. Later that day, as Blake wiped his hands with an old rag and watched the last of the kids leave the building, he sat on the curb, exhaling a breath he didn't realize he was holding. The air was still. His hands were sore. His shirt had paint on it. And for the first time in years, he felt like he belonged somewhere. Even if Emma never came back. He was no longer the man who made the bet. He was someone else now. And maybe, just maybe, she could see that too. Emma had no intention of giving him another chance. She told herself that 100 times. She repeated it like a vow each morning, folding it between the pages of her planner, tucking it into the routines that had saved her from heartbreak. But still, she noticed. She noticed the way Blake showed up to volunteer events, not just early, but ready. No phone in hand, no distractions, no aloof detachment. Just hands that reached for boxes, eyes that stayed focused, words that landed with sincerity. She noticed how he no longer tried to impress her, or anyone. He spoke less, listened more. He wasn't trying to be seen anymore. He was just there, present. And something in her, something cautious and scarred, began to lower its guard. They started having brief conversations again. A few minutes by the coffee table. Small talk at the end of meetings. One day she even laughed at something he said, a real laugh, short and surprised. It caught them both off guard. Blake didn't push. He didn't ask for coffee, or another chance, or forgiveness. He simply asked how her week was. And when she answered, he actually listened. One Saturday, after helping with a literacy workshop for local teens, Emma found him outside, sitting on the back steps, looking at the sky like he was waiting for it to answer a question he didn't know how to ask. She sat beside him. Neither of them spoke for a while. The city hummed in the background. The sun was low, stretching long shadows across the pavement. Then, quietly, Emma broke the silence. "You've changed." Blake turned, surprised. Not at the words, but at the fact that she'd noticed enough to say them out loud. "I'm trying," he replied. She nodded. "I can see that." There was another long pause, but this time it didn't feel heavy. "I'm not here because I want you to fall in love with me again," he said. "I'm here because I want to be someone who deserves the kind of love you gave, whether or not I ever get it back." Emma looked at him carefully. Her voice was steady. "You're not the man I married." He lowered his eyes. "I know. You're not the man I divorced either," she added. That made him glance up. She wasn't smiling, but her expression was softer now, less guarded, more curious. "That matters?" he asked. "It does," she said. "But it doesn't fix what was broken." "Not yet." "I understand." Emma reached into her bag and pulled out a folded paper. She handed it to him. It was one of his letters. "The woman at the front desk said you left this behind by mistake. I didn't read it, but I figured you might want it back." Blake stared at the envelope in his hand, recognizing the date on the corner. It was from a week ago. Emma rose from the step. As she turned to go, she paused. "You don't have to win me back," she said, her back still to him. "Just keep being who you're trying to be. For you. Not for me." She walked away, not quickly this time, not with the urgency of someone escaping, but with the quiet pace of someone who might, eventually, turn around. And for the first time, Blake didn't feel lost watching her go. He felt found. Because love wasn't about earning forgiveness or rewriting history. It was about becoming. And for once, he wasn't chasing the ending. He was living the middle, one real moment at a time. 6 months had passed since Emma handed him the divorce papers. 5 months since she said goodbye. 3 months since she first noticed something had changed in his eyes. 2 since they started speaking again. And now, today, she called him. Not with bitterness. Not with hesitation. Just a quiet, unexpected, "Hey, Blake, would you want to grab coffee sometime?" No mention of reconciliation. No dramatic undertone. Just a simple offer. Two people sitting across from each other, as they are now, not who they once pretended to be. They met at a small cafe on the Lower East Side. One of those places with mismatched chairs, indie music playing softly in the background, and the smell of cinnamon baked into the wood. Blake arrived first, unsure whether to feel anxious or grateful. Emma walked in 5 minutes later. Hair loose. A dark green sweater. A look in her eyes that wasn't cold anymore, but not wide open either. Something in between. She sat across from him, folded her hands over the table, and smiled. Not the smile he once broke. A new one. Softer. Wiser. They ordered coffee. Black for him. Oat milk latte for her. The same way she always had it. And when their drinks arrived, they didn't toast, didn't fumble for conversation. They just began. Books came first. Emma had just finished The Night Watchman by Louise Erdrich. Blake was slowly making his way through Man's Search for Meaning, which made her smile in that ironic, knowing way that said, "Of course you are." Then came Childhood Stories, his about a dog named Milo who ran away every summer but always came back. Hers about sneaking romance novels under her pillow when she was 12 and thinking she was subtle. They talked about fear, about loneliness, about how you can share a home with someone and still feel invisible. They laughed at things that shouldn't have been funny, like how she once set off the fire alarm making banana bread, or how he once lied about knowing how to ski and ended up with a dislocated shoulder and a bruised ego. At no point did Blake mention the word us, and that was what struck Emma the most. He wasn't sitting there trying to undo the past or plead for a second chance. He was just there, present, listening, fully himself, but new. Somewhere, in the middle of a conversation about nothing at all, she looked at him and realized something. He'd finally learned what love really looked like. Not the kind you claim or chase or manipulate, but the kind that waits without pressure, that shows up, listens, changes silently in the background. When the coffee cups were empty, neither moved right away. Blake glanced down at the table, then back up. "Thank you for this. For the hour. For not turning away." Emma tilted her head. "I didn't come here because I'm thinking about getting back together," she said honestly. "I know," he replied without flinching. "I came here," she continued, "because for the first time I wanted to." Blake didn't smile. He didn't reach for her hand. He just nodded. And that was enough. Because for the first time, Emma wasn't reacting to who he used to be. She was seeing who he was now. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something neither of them expected. The sky was overcast, soft gray light filtering through the trees of Central Park. Autumn had just begun to touch the leaves, and the world smelled faintly of earth, cold air, and the promise of change. Blake walked slowly beside her. Emma. No longer his wife. No longer the woman who waited for him at a dinner table that stayed cold. She wasn't his anything, not officially. But she was there, beside him, hands tucked in the pockets of her coat, face calm, and that meant more than he could explain. They walked without words at first, their steps falling into rhythm, their silence comfortable. The city buzzed in the distance, but here, in this moment, there was no noise that mattered. They passed a bench, the one near the lake. Emma paused. "I used to come here," she said softly. "During the last month we were married. I'd sit here and try to figure out what I was doing wrong, what I could fix." Blake stopped beside her, nodding, not trying to explain, not trying to rewrite the past. "I didn't notice you were slipping away," he said after a long moment. "Not until you were already gone." Emma looked at him, and her eyes didn't hold blame anymore, just memory. "I wasn't slipping," she replied. "I was walking, slowly, quietly, hoping you'd say something before I disappeared completely." He lowered his gaze. "I should have." "Yes," she said, "but you didn't." And that was part of the story. They sat down on the bench, side by side. No touching. No tension, just truth. "I still write letters," he said quietly. Emma smiled faintly. "Do you still keep them in that wooden box?" "I do. Every Sunday." There was a pause, and then she asked, "Why?" "Because I want to keep track of the man I'm becoming, even if no one else ever reads them." Emma exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cool air. "You've changed, Blake." He turned to her. "So have you." She looked out toward the lake, where the surface rippled gently with the wind. "I think I stopped waiting for someone to rescue me," she said. "And I rescued myself. That's what changed everything." He nodded. "I'm glad you did." Emma turned to face him. "I'm not promising anything," she said. "We're not picking up where we left off. That place doesn't exist anymore." "I know. But I don't feel broken anymore," she added. "And I don't feel angry. I feel like I've rebuilt something. And I don't mind letting you walk beside me for a while, if you want to." Blake didn't smile. He didn't reach for her hand right away. He just looked at her the way he never had when they were married. Like she was a person, not a project. Like she was someone whose soul he had nearly missed. Then, slowly, he reached out. Not to claim her. Not to hold on. Just to offer his hand. And for the first time since the wedding that started as a game, Emma took it, not as a wife, not as a victim, but as a woman who had learned to choose herself first. She didn't promise him forever. But she promised him now. And as they sat together, quiet and still, a new chapter began. Not a second chance. A first one.